On a frozen night in January 1936, while Europe slept under the weight of an uncertain future, something unseen shifted in the spiritual realm, something that would quietly bind a humble friar in southern Italy to the soul of one of the most powerful men on earth. And if this opening already unsettles you, pause for a moment and ask yourself how many moments in history unfolded, without headlines, without witnesses, yet changed eternity forever. In a small stone cell in San Giovanni Rotondo, Padre Pio suddenly dropped to his knees, not from illness, not from pain, but from urgency, an urgency that came from beyond time. Those present froze as he whispered words that cut through the silence like a blade. Pray for a soul that will soon appear before the divine tribunal. There was no explanation, no name, no drama, only gravity, the kind of gravity that comes when heaven touches earth. They prayed. Minutes later, Padre Pio rose slowly and asked a question that made the air feel heavy. "Do you know for whom you have prayed?" When they shook their heads, he answered calmly, almost casually, "For the King of England." At that very hour, thousands of miles away in London, King George V was dying, his final breath leaving his body, while the world still believed him stable, still believed him alive. This is not folklore, not rumor, but an account preserved in Bernard Ruffin's biography, Padre Pio, the true story. And before dismissing it as coincidence, consider how many times in your own life you felt compelled to pray, to pause, to act, without knowing why. King George V was not a Catholic monarch longing for Rome. He was the head of a nation born from schism, heir to a crown that had rejected papal authority centuries earlier, a ruler who openly dismissed Marian devotion and the Mass as superstition. Yet when his soul approached judgment, it was not political power, lineage, or ideology that mattered, only mercy. On that night, as the king lay dying of emphysema, his physician administered a lethal dose of morphine and cocaine to hasten death, a grim detail later confirmed by historical records. And as the Archbishop of Canterbury recited prayers meant to comfort the departing, the king reportedly uttered his last words, words of anger, not repentance, "God damn you," before falling silent. Yet even as those words echoed in a London bedroom, intercession had already begun in a monastery cell in Italy. Padre Pio did not choose this moment. It was given to him, imposed upon him, as so many of his supernatural experiences were. He often said that souls appeared to him not to frighten, but to beg, not to accuse, but to hope. And here lies the first uncomfortable truth of this story. Divine mercy is not distributed according to our categories. Padre Pio prayed for kings and beggars alike, not because he approved of their lives, but because he understood the terror of standing alone before God. England's separation from Rome, initiated by Henry VIII's ambitions centuries earlier, had hardened into national identity, theology, and power. But Padre Pio saw beyond history books and politics. He saw a soul. And if that idea unsettles you, that a man who rejected Catholic devotion could still be surrounded by prayer at the hour of death, then you are beginning to touch the real tension of this story. Padre Pio believed that God's justice is exact, but his mercy is relentless, and that no soul is beyond the reach of intercession as long as life remains, and perhaps even in its final instant. He once said that the moment of death is not merely an ending, but a crossing, a narrow bridge where even the smallest prayer can tip the balance, and this is where the story stops being about a king and becomes about you. How many times have you assumed that someone was too far gone, too hardened, too distant from faith to matter? How many times have you withheld prayer because judgment felt easier than hope? Padre Pio's life stands as a quiet rebuke to that instinct. He did not wait for news reports or confirmations. He responded to grace in real time. He did not ask whether the king deserved prayer. He asked whether the soul needed it, and this distinction changes everything. The power in this moment is not that Padre Pio predicted a death, but that he participated in it spiritually, standing in the gap when no one else knew to stand there. He believed that prayer is not symbolic, but operative, that it moves, reaches, intervenes, even when the world is unaware. If this story moves you, if it raises questions rather than answers, I invite you to reflect in the comments. Do you believe prayer can reach beyond visible boundaries, beyond denominations, beyond history itself? Padre Pio certainly did, and his confidence did not come from theory but from encounters that marked his entire life. He lived with the constant awareness that heaven is not distant and that judgment is not abstract. To him, the divine tribunal was not a metaphor but a reality before which every crown dissolves. This night in 1936 reveals something deeply unsettling and deeply hopeful at the same time, that God may allow a soul who lived far from the church to be surrounded by unseen mercy at the final moment, and that he may choose the prayers of a stigmatized friar in a mountain village as the instrument of that mercy. This is not a story meant to comfort complacency. It is a warning against presumption. Padre Pio never claimed the king was saved. He claimed only that prayer was offered, that mercy was invoked, that heaven was engaged. The outcome remained God's alone. And perhaps that is the most sobering lesson. Intercession does not control God, it entrusts souls to him. As we move deeper into this account, we will confront what Padre Pio later revealed about souls at judgment, about purgatory, about the terrifying honesty of that moment when all illusions fall away. But for now, let this question linger uncomfortably. If God allowed the soul of a king who rejected the church to be prayed for at the threshold of eternity, whom are you neglecting to pray for today? What makes that night in January 1936 so unsettling is not simply that Padre Pio sensed the death of a king, but that he reacted as if the event demanded immediate spiritual action, as if heaven itself had sounded an alarm that could not be ignored. And this reveals something essential about how he understood death, judgment, and human responsibility. To Padre Pio, death was never private. It was never isolated. It was a moment that reverberated through the entire spiritual body of humanity. He believed that when a soul approaches the divine tribunal, the church on earth is mysteriously invited to participate not as judges, but as intercessors, and this invitation, once perceived, carries moral weight. Ignoring it is not neutral. It is a refusal to love. Those who lived with Padre Pio testified that moments like this were not rare. He would suddenly interrupt conversations, meals, even confessions, overcome by an interior urgency to pray. Sometimes he named the soul, sometimes he did not. Sometimes he wept openly, other times he prayed in total silence. But always, those moments carried the same gravity, the sense that something irreversible was unfolding beyond the walls of the monastery. He often said that, at the hour of death, the soul is stripped of all masks. Titles, honors, ideology, and reputation collapse instantly. What remains is truth, naked and unavoidable. For a king who had ruled an empire, this stripping would have been total. No crown follows the soul into eternity. Padre Pio taught that the greatest tragedy of modern humanity is not sin itself, but the illusion that death will be negotiated later. He warned constantly against presumption, against the idea that there will always be more time, more chances, more clarity. He said many souls are lost, not because God refuses mercy, but because they delay repentance until the moment when the will is too weakened, too clouded, too fearful to respond. This is why the intercession that night mattered so deeply to him. The king's final words, spoken in anger and pain, reflected a soul under immense pressure, a soul facing truth without preparation. Padre Pio understood that when a soul is in such a state, it does not need arguments or explanations, it needs mercy. There is a detail in this story that is often overlooked, but is crucial to understanding its theological weight. Padre Pio did not say, "The king has died." He said, "Pray for a soul that will soon appear before the divine tribunal." His focus was not on death as a biological event, but on judgment as a spiritual reality. He believed judgment is immediate, personal, and absolute, yet he also believed that God allows a mysterious window, a final moment where grace can still operate through the prayers of others. This belief is deeply rooted in Catholic tradition, though rarely spoken of so plainly. It is the same logic behind praying for the dying, behind last rites, behind final blessings. Padre Pio simply experienced this reality with terrifying clarity. If you are listening to this story and feeling uneasy, that reaction is appropriate. It is not meant to be comfortable. It forces us to confront how casually we treat the end of life, how easily we assume outcomes that are not ours to declare. Padre Pio never claimed to know the eternal fate of King George V. He did not say the king was saved. He did not say he was condemned. He said only that prayer was necessary. That restraint is important. In a world obsessed with certainty and conclusions, Padre Pio remained obedient to mystery. He acted where he was permitted and remained silent where God alone judges. After that night, Padre Pio reportedly spoke very little about the event. This silence itself is revealing. He was not interested in spectacle or narrative drama. He did not use the story to condemn England, Anglicanism, or monarchy. His concern was always the soul, never the system. He once said that souls suffer more from indifference than from hatred. Hatred at least acknowledges God. Indifference erases him. In that sense, the king's final struggle reflected a broader spiritual crisis, one that Padre Pio believed was spreading across the modern world, a crisis where power, progress, and pride slowly suffocate humility and dependence on God. Padre Pio also believed that souls who receive prayer at the moment of death never forget it. He taught that if a soul is saved, even through purgatory, it becomes an intercessor for those who prayed for it. If this is true, then the implications are staggering. A stigmatized friar praying in obscurity for a dying king could have created a bond that transcends history, a bond invisible to politics but recognized in eternity. And this possibility challenges our assumptions about influence. Who truly shapes history? The rulers whose names fill textbooks, or the hidden souls whose prayers shape outcomes no one sees? At this point, it is worth pausing and asking yourself a difficult question, one you may want to reflect on privately or share in the comments if you feel compelled. If you knew that someone, even someone who openly rejected your beliefs, was approaching death right now, would you pray for them, or would you justify your silence? Padre Pio's life suggests that love does not wait for ideological alignment. It responds to need. There is another layer to this story that deepens its weight. King George V was not simply any ruler. He was the symbolic head of a nation that had formally severed itself from Rome. His death therefore carried a symbolic dimension, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. Padre Pio understood symbols, but he was never seduced by them. He did not interpret the king's death as divine punishment or historical irony. He interpreted it as a human soul standing before God. This refusal to politicize spiritual events is one of the reasons the Church ultimately trusted him, despite years of investigation and suspicion. Padre Pio's experiences with souls at judgment shaped his entire approach to ministry. It is why he spent endless hours in the confessional. It is why he was severe with some penitents and tender with others. He could see when someone was playing games with grace and when someone was genuinely afraid. He believed fear could still be redeemed, but indifference rarely could. That night in 1936 confirmed what he already knew. Death does not equal clarity. Some souls arrive confused, resistant, angry, or terrified. Prayer does not override free will, but it can soften resistance, strengthen courage, and illuminate truth. As this story unfolds further, we will confront what Padre Pio later revealed about purgatory, about the state of souls who are neither damned nor glorified, and about how prayer continues to operate even after death. The night he prayed for a king was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern that reveals how heaven and earth remain connected far more intimately than most modern minds are willing to accept. And if this challenges your assumptions, that is precisely its purpose. Because according to Padre Pio, faith that never unsettles you is faith that has stopped growing. What followed that night in January 1936 did not end with silence alone. It began a deeper, interior burden that those close to Padre Pio would notice in the days and weeks afterward. A weight that did not express itself in words, but in an intensified urgency of prayer, fasting, and sacrifice. Those who lived with him observed that after encounters involving souls at judgment, he became more withdrawn, more severe with himself, as if he were carrying not only the suffering of that soul, but also the warning it represented for the living. He once confided to a brother that when a soul stands before God, the truth it faces is so overwhelming that even angels tremble, not out of fear, but out of awe before divine justice and mercy colliding in perfect balance. Padre Pio taught that purgatory is not a place invented to frighten believers, but a mercy designed to complete what was left unfinished. In his spiritual vision, purgatory was not primarily fire, but clarity. It was the moment when a soul finally sees itself as God sees it, without excuses, without self-deception, without the comforting illusions of status or power. This is why he believed prayers at the hour of death were so crucial. They do not erase consequences, but they can change the soul's posture, transforming resistance into surrender, pride into humility, fear into trust. For someone like King George V, formed by authority, discipline, and command, that surrender would have been particularly difficult. Padre Pio understood that the stronger the personality, the more painful the moment of letting go. There is a striking consistency in Padre Pio's testimony across decades. Souls who appeared to him often spoke not of terror, but of regret. Regret not for what they suffered, but for what they delayed. They lamented postponed repentance, postponed forgiveness, postponed humility. He said many souls cried out, "If only I had known." And his response was always the same interior sorrow, because they had known, but had believed there would always be more time. This is the illusion modern humanity lives under, an illusion Padre Pio believed was becoming more widespread with technological progress and political power. The faster the world moved, the more it forgot eternity. The story of the king's soul fits precisely into this pattern. A man surrounded by privilege, protected by institutions, insulated from ordinary vulnerability, suddenly faced the most democratic of all realities, death. No army, no physician, no crown could intervene. Padre Pio did not see this as tragic in a theatrical sense, but as instructional. He believed God allows certain moments to ripple outward as warnings, not threats. The king's death was not a message to England as a nation, but to every soul tempted to confuse stability with salvation. In private conversations, Padre Pio sometimes spoke about rulers and leaders as souls under heavier judgment, not because God is harsher with them, but because responsibility magnifies consequence. He would say that authority does not disappear at death, it is accounted for. Influence becomes evidence, decisions become testimony, silence becomes guilt. He warned that leaders who neglect the spiritual good of their people, even unintentionally, will face painful purification. This does not mean condemnation, but it does mean truth without anesthesia. In this light, the intercession offered that night was not a courtesy, but an act of profound charity, an attempt to surround a powerful yet vulnerable soul with prayer at the moment it needed it most. Padre Pio also believed that God deliberately chooses unexpected intercessors. Why a poor friar in southern Italy for a British king? Precisely because it strips the event of political meaning and leaves only grace. Heaven, he said, loves paradox. It uses the weak to serve the strong, the hidden to reach the visible, the forgotten to remind the famous that they are dust. This is not humiliation, it is mercy disguised as irony. And if this story unsettles our sense of control, that too is intentional. It reveals a world governed less by systems than by souls. At this point, it is worth reflecting on another uncomfortable truth Padre Pio insisted upon. Prayer does not always feel powerful when it matters most. He said the most effective prayers are often the driest, the heaviest, the ones said without consolation, On that night there was no vision of light, no reassurance, no heavenly confirmation offered to him. There was only urgency. He prayed without knowing the outcome, without receiving emotional reward. This, he taught, is the purest form of love, intercession without attachment to results. In a culture obsessed with feedback and validation, this kind of prayer feels useless, yet he insisted it is the kind heaven relies on most. Those who heard this story later sometimes asked whether Padre Pio believed the king was saved. He never answered. His silence was deliberate. He believed curiosity about outcomes often masks avoidance of responsibility. What matters is not knowing where another soul ended, but whether we responded when called to love. He once said that God does not ask us to calculate eternity, but to participate in mercy. The rest belongs to Him. There is another dimension to this event that deepens its relevance today. Padre Pio believed that as societies drift from God, death becomes increasingly medicalized, managed, and sanitized. The king's death, hastened by his physician, reflects this modern impulse to control even the final breath. Padre Pio was deeply troubled by this trend. He believed that removing spiritual awareness from death robs the soul of its final opportunity for surrender. This is not an argument against medicine, but against the exclusion of God from the most decisive human moment. The fact that Padre Pio intervened spiritually while the world intervened chemically is a contrast that should give us pause. If you are still listening, consider this question, and if you feel moved, share your thoughts. How often do we pray for the dying, not just in general, but concretely, intentionally, without knowing their beliefs or choices? Padre Pio prayed not because the king deserved it, but because he needed it. That distinction matters. As time passed, Padre Pio's conviction about the importance of intercession only intensified. He would later say that the modern world is filled with souls dying alone, not physically but spiritually, surrounded by people, yet untouched by prayer. He believed this spiritual loneliness was one of the greatest wounds of the age. The night he prayed for the king was, in his mind, a small act of resistance against that loneliness, a reminder that no soul should cross the threshold of eternity without being accompanied by love. This brings us to the next stage of the story, one that shifts from the moment of death to what follows after. Padre Pio did not only speak of judgment, but of purification, of souls who returned to him asking for help long after their earthly lives had ended. To understand the full meaning of that January night, we must now look at what he revealed about purgatory itself, and why he believed the prayers of the living continue to shape eternity long after the final breath is drawn. Padre Pio often said that if the living truly understood purgatory, the world would never be the same again, not because people would live in fear, but because they would live with urgency. For him, purgatory was not a distant theological concept debated in books. It was a lived reality, populated by souls he encountered as tangibly as the friars who walked past his cell. After nights like the one in January 1936, when he had interceded for the soul of a king, these encounters intensified, as though heaven itself was drawing closer, reminding him that death does not end responsibility, relationship, or love. He described purgatory as the place where masks finally fall. On earth, a soul can hide behind reputation, achievement, education, rank, or even religion itself. In purgatory, none of that remains. What stands before God is not a title or a biography, but a naked truth. What the soul loved, what it feared, and what it refused to let go of. Padre Pio said this is why purgatory is painful, not because God is cruel, but because truth burns when the soul has spent a lifetime avoiding it. The fire is not imposed from the outside, it rises from within. Those who heard him speak on this subject were often startled by how calmly he described it. There was no drama in his voice, no attempt to terrify. Instead, there was sorrow, the sorrow of a physician watching patients who delayed treatment until the disease had spread everywhere. He said, "Many souls arrive in purgatory shocked, not by judgment, but by how unprepared they are to receive love." They loved comfort more than conversion, control more than surrender, respect more than humility. And now, stripped of distractions, they must learn love from the beginning. This is where the prayers of the living become decisive. Padre Pio insisted that purgatory is the one place where charity is most urgently needed, because the souls there can no longer help themselves. They cannot merit, they cannot choose, they can only receive. And God, in his design, has chosen to bind their purification to the love of the Church on earth. This is not inefficiency, it is communion. It ensures that salvation is never a solitary affair. The living and the dead remain bound together in responsibility. In conversations with spiritual children, Padre Pio would often say that neglecting the dead is one of the quiet sins of modern Christianity. People move on quickly, he said. They assume heaven automatically. They confuse funerals with absolution. He did not deny hope, but he rejected presumption. He warned that presumption is the enemy of love because it excuses inaction. Why pray if everything is already settled? Why sacrifice if nothing is required? This mentality, he believed, leaves countless souls waiting longer than necessary, not because God is slow, but because love has grown cold. The night he prayed for the king illustrates this truth with unsettling clarity. A soul formed in power, authority, and separation from Rome now depended on the prayers of a poor friar he had never met. This reversal was not accidental. Padre Pio believed God orchestrates such moments to reveal the hidden economy of grace, where what appears weak becomes decisive and what appears strong becomes dependent. Kings need beggars, leaders need monks, the living need the dead, and the dead need the living. He also revealed that souls in purgatory retain memory, but without self-deception. They remember their lives with perfect clarity. They know who prayed for them and who did not. This knowledge is not used for resentment, but it deepens gratitude. Padre Pio said that when a soul is released through prayer, it becomes a powerful intercessor for those who helped it. Heaven is not a reward disconnected from earth. It is a relationship transformed. The soul you assist becomes your advocate. The mercy you offer returns multiplied. This is why Padre Pio took Mass intentions so seriously. He once said that a single Mass offered with love can shorten years of purification, not because God is persuaded, but because Christ's sacrifice is made present, and nothing stands unchanged before that reality. When Padre Pio offered Mass for a soul, he did so with a concentration that frightened witnesses. He trembled, he wept. He seemed to carry the soul on the altar with him. To him, the Mass was not symbolic, it was transactional in the most sacred sense. Something happened, something shifted. In the context of the king's soul, this becomes even more significant. Padre Pio knew that earthly authority often distances people from dependence, and dependence is the posture required to receive grace. A king accustomed to command must learn to ask. A ruler used to obedience must learn surrender. This does not happen instantly. Purgatory, in this case, would not be punishment for rebellion against Rome, but purification from attachment to self-rule. The prayers offered that night and in the days following would have softened that process, not erasing justice but bathing it in mercy. Padre Pio also warned that modern society was losing the sense of collective intercession. People pray privately, sporadically, and often only when personally affected. He believed this fragmentation weakened the Church's spiritual immune system. In earlier centuries, communities prayed for the dead as a matter of course. Names were remembered. Anniversaries were observed. Masses were offered regularly. As this practice faded, he believed purgatory, quietly filled with souls, forgotten not by God, but by the living. If this story stirs something uncomfortable, it is meant to. Padre Pio did not tell such stories to satisfy curiosity about the afterlife. He told them to provoke action. And this is where the narrative turns toward us. Because if a soul as distant from Catholic practice as a Protestant king received urgent intercession, what excuse do we have for neglecting our own dead? Parents, grandparents, friends, priests, strangers who died alone, victims of war, of addiction, of despair. Padre Pio believed many of these souls wait not for condemnation, but for remembrance. He once said that one day, at judgment, people would be shown not only their sins, but also the prayers they failed to offer. This was not said to induce guilt, but awareness. Love has consequences, and so does its absence. The night of January 1936 stands as a warning and an invitation, a warning that no one is beyond the need for mercy, and an invitation to become instruments of that mercy while time still allows it. As we move forward in this story, we must now confront the moment that inevitably follows intercession, revelation. Padre Pio did not only pray for souls, he sometimes saw what awaited them, not in detail, but in impression, enough to leave him shaken. In the next part, we will examine what he revealed about judgment itself, not as a courtroom, but as an encounter, and why he believed that the greatest shock for most souls is not punishment, but truth. Padre Pio spoke of judgment not as a scene of thunder and accusation, but as an encounter so intimate and so piercing that it leaves no room for denial. He insisted that when a soul stands before God, it is not questioned in words. There is no interrogation, no argument, no defense. The soul simply sees. It sees itself in the light of absolute truth, and in that light, every excuse collapses. What terrifies most souls, he said, is not that God condemns them, but that God agrees with what they have become. Judgment is not imposed, it is revealed. This understanding explains why Padre Pio reacted so strongly after moments of intercession, like the night he prayed for the king. He knew that prayer at the hour of death does not change the truth of a life, but it can change how that truth is faced. A soul supported by prayer is less likely to recoil from the light. It is more capable of humility, more capable of saying, "Yes, this is me, and I place myself in your mercy." Without that support, many souls resist, not out of rebellion, but out of shame. Padre Pio said shame is more dangerous than sin, because shame makes the soul hide from the very love meant to heal it. He once explained judgment using an image that unsettled those who heard it. He said that at death, the soul runs toward God with all the desire it has cultivated during life. If it has loved God, it runs freely. If it has loved itself, power, pleasure, or control, it still runs, but those attachments burn as it approaches the light. Hell, he said, is not a place God sends souls to, but a state where the soul refuses to let go of what it loves more than God. Purgatory is where the soul wants God, but still clings to lesser loves that must be purified. Heaven is where nothing remains but love. In this framework, the story of the king becomes even more striking. A life shaped by authority, discipline, and separation from Rome would not necessarily be a life devoid of conscience. Padre Pio believed many souls outside the visible boundaries of the Church lived according to the light they were given. But he also believed that light creates responsibility. To know order without humility, discipline without surrender, power without dependence is to build a soul that struggles when control is finally removed. Judgment, in such cases, is not about doctrine alone, but about orientation. Where did the soul turn when it could no longer command? Padre Pio said that many souls are shocked at judgment because they realize too late that morality alone is not communion. Doing one's duty is not the same as loving God. Religion practiced as obligation without relationship leaves the heart untouched. This is why he insisted so fiercely on interior conversion. He warned priests and lay people alike that external correctness can coexist with interior emptiness. When such a soul meets God, the absence of intimacy is revealed instantly. That absence hurts more than any accusation. Those close to Padre Pio recalled that after profound visions related to judgment, he would often repeat one phrase under his breath, too late, but he did not say this about God's mercy. He said it about wasted time. He believed the tragedy of most souls is not great sin, but delay. Delay in forgiveness, delay in repentance, delay in surrender, delay in prayer. Death, he said, does not create these delays, it exposes them. This is why he urged constant readiness, not in fear, but in honesty. He told his spiritual children to live as if death were near, not to abandon life, but to purify intention. If today were the day, what would you cling to? What would you regret not having done? Who would you wish you had forgiven? These questions were not meant to paralyze, but to awaken. Padre Pio believed awareness of death sharpens love, while denial dulls it. In relation to the king's soul, judgment would have been a moment of profound stripping. No crown, no titles, no nation, only a man before his creator. Padre Pio's intercession did not erase the weight of that encounter, but it may have softened its edges. He believed prayer creates a climate of mercy around the soul, not replacing justice, but making it bearable. Justice without love crushes. Justice with love heals. Padre Pio also revealed that judgment is instantaneous, yet experienced subjectively as overwhelming. Time, as we know it, collapses. The soul sees its entire life at once, not as a series of events, but as a pattern of love and refusal. The smallest acts matter: a withheld kindness, a suppressed truth, a prayer postponed. These are not forgotten. They appear not as accusations, but as missed opportunities for communion. If this feels unsettling, it should. Padre Pio never intended comfort without conversion, but he also insisted that judgment is not the end of the story for most souls. For many, it is the beginning of purification. Purgatory, he said, is judgment completed in hope. It is the soul saying, "I see now, and I consent to be healed." This consent is crucial. Souls who accept purification move forward. Souls who resist suffer more, not because God punishes resistance, but because resistance prolongs pain. Padre Pio believed the prayers offered at death often determine whether a soul consents quickly or resists stubbornly. This is why he interrupted conversations, meals, even confessions to pray when he sensed a soul crossing the threshold. He once said that a single sincere prayer at that moment can tip the balance between surrender and defiance. Not because God is persuaded, but because the soul is strengthened. Pause for a moment and consider this, and if it resonates, reflect or share. How often do we pray for those who are dying right now, unknown to us, in hospitals, homes, war zones, places of isolation? Padre Pio believed the modern world produces more lonely deaths than any previous era, not because people are physically alone, but because prayer has grown scarce. He believed heaven feels this absence acutely. As we move deeper into this account, one truth becomes unavoidable. Padre Pio did not see the afterlife as a distant abstraction. He saw it as a continuation of relationships shaped on earth. Judgment does not erase who we loved or ignored. It fulfills those choices. The night he prayed for the king was not an isolated miracle, but a sign of how urgently the living are still needed in the destiny of the dead. In the next part, we will confront one of the most misunderstood aspects of Padre Pio's testimony: why some souls appeared to him repeatedly, lingering in purification far longer than expected, and what he revealed about the hidden obstacles that delay liberation even after judgment has been passed. Padre Pio revealed that one of the most surprising truths about the afterlife is not how many souls are saved, but how long many of them remain in purification. He said this was the detail that shocked him most when souls began to appear to him regularly. These were not hardened criminals or notorious sinners, but ordinary people, many of them devout by external standards, who had lived respectable lives, attended Mass, raised families, and avoided scandal. And yet they lingered, they waited. They suffered not because God withheld mercy, but because something within them resisted complete surrender. He explained that purgatory is prolonged, not by God's reluctance to forgive, but by the soul's attachment to itself. Even after judgment, even after seeing the truth clearly, some souls struggle to release habits of control, pride, resentment, or self-justification that had shaped them for decades. These attachments are subtle. They do not always look like sin on earth. They look like preferences, opinions, emotional wounds left unhealed, grudges justified, identities fiercely protected. In the light of God, however, these become weights that prevent the soul from rising freely. Padre Pio said that many souls arrive in purgatory convinced their purification would be brief, only to realize that what they called my personality on earth was, in fact, a web of attachments incompatible with perfect love. He described souls who suffered intensely not because of gross immorality, but because they had never learned humility. They were generous but controlling, faithful but rigid, moral but unmerciful. Their suffering came from the painful unlearning of self-centered virtues. This sheds new light on the king's soul. A life lived in command inevitably ingrains habits of authority, judgment, and distance. Even if such a man lived according to conscience, the internal posture of command would not disappear instantly at death. Padre Pio believed that purification for such souls often involved learning dependence for the first time. Not symbolic dependence, but real vulnerability, the inability to command outcomes, the necessity of waiting, the acceptance of help from others. This, he said, is one of the hardest lessons for powerful souls. He also revealed that purgatory is communal. Souls are aware of one another. They do not suffer in isolation, but in shared longing. This awareness intensifies both pain and hope. Pain, because they see others advance more quickly through purification. Hope, because they understand why. Souls helped by prayer move faster. Souls remembered rise sooner. Souls forgotten wait longer. This realization does not breed envy, but sorrow. Padre Pio said, many souls lamented not their sins, but the fact that they were no longer remembered on earth. This is where the responsibility of the living becomes unavoidable. Padre Pio insisted that many prolonged purifications could be shortened dramatically if the living understood their role. He said, heaven is not stingy with grace. It is waiting for cooperation. The Church on earth is meant to function as a living current of mercy flowing into purgatory. When that current weakens, purification slows. When it strengthens, souls are lifted. He often spoke about forgotten souls, those who died without family, without descendants, without anyone to pray for them. He said these souls suffer a unique loneliness, not because God abandons them, but because the bond of communion has been neglected. Padre Pio made it a practice to pray daily for the most abandoned souls, believing that these prayers were among the most powerful because they were offered without personal attachment. He taught that selfless prayer carries extraordinary weight. Those close to him noticed that after encounters involving delayed purification, Padre Pio intensified his sacrifices. He fasted more severely. He reduced sleep. He accepted physical pain without complaint. He offered these sufferings intentionally, believing they could be applied to souls trapped by long-standing attachments. This was not masochism. It was intercession, lived at the cost of comfort. He believed suffering accepted in love becomes a currency that heaven uses efficiently. He once explained that purgatory does not end automatically with time, because time, as we know it, does not exist there. Purification ends when attachment ends. Prayer helps dissolve attachment by introducing grace that the soul can accept, but the soul must still consent. This is why Padre Pio emphasized the importance of humility on earth. A humble soul, he said, passes quickly. A proud soul waits. In relation to King George V, Padre Pio never described what he saw afterward. His silence suggests reverence, but his teachings allow us to infer the struggle such a soul would face. A life shaped by discipline and order would need to learn childlike trust. A man who commanded nations would need to learn to receive. A ruler who shaped history would need to accept being shaped. This transformation is painful, but it is mercy at work. Padre Pio warned that modern culture makes purification harder by encouraging self-definition without reference to God. When people spend their lives asserting identity, defending opinions, and curating image, they die with tightly bound selves. Untying these knots takes time. This is why he urged people to practice detachment while alive, to forgive quickly, to surrender arguments, to accept correction, to embrace obscurity. These practices, he said, feel like losses on earth, but become shortcuts in eternity. If this message feels personal, it should. Padre Pio did not share these truths to inspire speculation about others, but examination of self. He believed purgatory begins on earth. Every moment of humility accepted here reduces suffering later. Every act of mercy practiced now shortens purification. Every prayer offered for the dead prepares the living. Pause here and reflect, and if you wish, consider sharing. Whom have you forgotten to pray for? A parent, a relative, someone who died years ago? Padre Pio believed prayers offered long after death are still effective because God is not bound by time. He said no prayer arrives too late, it arrives exactly when needed. As we move toward the final stages of this story, one truth stands clear. Padre Pio's experiences were not meant to terrify, but to mobilize love. The king's soul, the lingering souls, the forgotten souls, all point toward the same responsibility. The living are not spectators in eternity, they are participants. In the next and final part, we will confront the ultimate meaning of this extraordinary night in 1936, not as a historical curiosity, but as a message addressed to every listener, revealing what Padre Pio believed would ultimately unite kings and peasants, living and dead, judgment and mercy in the heart of God. Padre Pio believed that the most decisive moment in a soul's journey does not happen at death, but in the countless hidden choices made long before it. He said that the judgment a soul faces before God is not a surprise imposed from outside, but a revelation of what the soul has been quietly becoming all along. This is why encounters like the night of January 1936 mattered so deeply to him. They confirmed something he had already learned through years of confession, prayer, and supernatural sight. No soul arrives before God unprepared. Every soul arrives carrying the shape of its loves. He explained that when a soul stands before God, it does not argue, it does not negotiate, it does not defend itself with explanations, it simply sees, and that sight is total. The soul sees every moment where love was chosen and every moment where love was refused. It sees how often mercy was delayed, how frequently pride was protected, how many times grace knocked and was ignored. This vision is not imposed by God as punishment. It arises naturally from the soul encountering perfect truth. Padre Pio said that for some souls, this encounter feels like relief. They finally understand what they never fully grasped on earth. For others, especially those who lived with confidence in their own righteousness, the encounter is devastating. Not because God condemns them, but because the soul condemns itself by comparison. It realizes how small its love actually was. This is why intercession at the moment of death is so powerful. The soul is most vulnerable then, not physically but spiritually. It is being stripped of illusion. Prayer offered at that moment does not change God's judgment. It changes the soul's capacity to receive mercy. Padre Pio believed that the prayers offered for King George V that night acted like a hand placed gently on a shoulder during a terrifying revelation, steadying the soul so it would not recoil from truth. He often described prayer as creating space in the soul, space where fear can soften, space where humility can enter, space where repentance can awaken, even in a soul that lived without explicit religious devotion. This is why he never limited his prayers to Catholics alone. He prayed for soldiers, skeptics, rulers, atheists, Jews, Protestants, and those who had never known the Church. He believed God judged fidelity to conscience with terrifying seriousness. Padre Pio taught that conscience is not a loophole, but a battlefield. To follow conscience sincerely requires courage, because conscience often demands sacrifice. Many people silence it gradually, not by rejecting God outright, but by choosing convenience. The danger, he said, is not ignorance, but comfort. Comfort dulls the voice of truth, and a dulled conscience leads to a shocked soul at judgment. In the case of a king, conscience is burdened by power. Power magnifies responsibility. Decisions ripple outward, affecting millions. Padre Pio believed that rulers face a unique purification because their choices carry communal consequences. A harsh policy, an indifferent command, a prideful stance does not remain private. It shapes lives. This weight follows the soul into eternity, not as accusation, but as reality that must be reconciled with love. Yet Padre Pio never spoke of this with bitterness. He spoke with sorrow and hope. Sorrow, because many powerful souls suffer greatly in purification. Hope, because God's mercy still reaches them. He insisted that no soul is beyond mercy if it remains open, even slightly. A single, sincere prayer, offered at the right moment, can tilt the balance toward humility rather than despair. He once told a spiritual child that heaven is not filled with heroes who never fell, but with souls who finally surrendered. This surrender, he said, is the key. The soul that clings to identity, reputation, or self-image resists purification. The soul that lets go, even late, rises quickly. This is why prayer for the dying is urgent. It encourages surrender at the moment when letting go feels most frightening. Padre Pio also warned against the illusion of safe distance. Many people believe their lives are too ordinary to matter eternally. He rejected this completely. He said that obscurity does not reduce responsibility. Every choice matters because every choice shapes love. A peasant who forgives generously may rise faster than a king who ruled justly but loved cautiously. Heaven does not measure influence, it measures surrender. He believed the communion of saints exists precisely to counteract the isolation of judgment. The living and the dead are not separated by silence. Prayer crosses the boundary effortlessly. When the living pray, they enter the most vulnerable moments of the dead. This is why Padre Pio treated every request for prayer as urgent. He knew he was not offering comfort. He was offering assistance at a critical juncture. Reflect for a moment here. How often do we pray for those we admire, but forget those we disagree with? Padre Pio prayed for both. He believed that mercy is most powerful when directed toward those we least understand. If this reflection resonates with you, consider leaving a comment or sharing it with someone who has lost a loved one. You may be participating in an unseen act of mercy. As Padre Pio aged, these insights deepened. He spoke less about visions and more about responsibility. He urged people to prepare now, not through fear, but through love. He said that the best preparation for death is learning to love without ownership, to serve without control, to forgive without memory. These habits, practiced daily, loosen the knots that later bind the soul. He often repeated that the afterlife does not begin after death. It begins with how we live today. Purgatory is not a separate chapter. It is the continuation of unfinished surrender. The soul does not become different overnight. It becomes more itself. This is why humility matters so much. Humility allows the soul to be reshaped without resistance. The night of January 1936 stands as a symbol of this truth. A king died, a friar prayed, heaven listened. The outcome was not spectacle but mercy in motion. Padre Pio did not claim triumph or insight into the final destiny of the king. He simply acted. That was his pattern. When in doubt, pray. When uncertain, intercede. When powerless, love. In the final part, we will gather all these threads into their ultimate meaning. We will see why Padre Pio considered this event not extraordinary, but representative. A window into how heaven responds when the living refuse indifference and choose intercession. and why, in his eyes, this night was not about a king at all, but about the responsibility carried by every soul still breathing. Padre Pio never wanted people to remember him for visions, prophecies, or extraordinary nights like the one in January 1936. He wanted them to remember one thing only: responsibility. Responsibility for the soul, responsibility for time, responsibility for love. To him, the story of the king's soul was not a dramatic exception. It was a warning disguised as mercy. It revealed how close eternity always is, how thin the veil truly is, and how much influence the living still possess over what seems already finished. He taught that death is not the end of influence, it is the end of illusion. On earth, we believe time belongs to us. We plan, postpone, excuse, delay. We assume tomorrow will always be available. But when the soul crosses the threshold, time collapses. There is no later, no revision, no rewriting of intention. What remains is orientation, where the soul was facing when the light appeared, toward itself or toward God. This is why Padre Pio insisted that prayer for the dying is not sentimental, but urgent. He said that at the moment of death, the soul experiences the most intense spiritual pressure it has ever known. Everything that distracted it in life, status, noise, pride, routine, falls away at once. What remains is naked desire, and desire, purified or not, determines movement. Prayer offered at that moment does not override justice. It strengthens the soul to endure truth without fleeing from it. He described God's judgment not as a courtroom, but as exposure. God does not interrogate the soul. He reveals himself. And in that revelation, the soul discovers whether it has learned how to love. Those who have practiced love imperfectly but sincerely feel pain, but also hope. Those who have perfected self-protection feel terror, because love feels foreign. Padre Pio often said that hell is not created by God, but chosen by the soul that cannot tolerate love. Heaven is not a reward, but a condition the soul must be capable of bearing. Purgatory exists because most souls love God, but not enough yet to survive the intensity of his presence. This is why purification is mercy, not punishment. It prepares the soul to endure joy. In this light, the prayer for King George V becomes clearer. Padre Pio did not change history, he responded to it. He did not erase a life, he accompanied its conclusion. He believed that at the moment the soul stands before God, even a small act of intercession can prevent despair from hardening into resistance. That is the difference between purification and rejection. What should trouble us is not whether a king was saved, but whether we understand our own position. Padre Pio believed most people misunderstand judgment because they misunderstand love. We imagine judgment as something that happens to us. He said, it is something that reveals us, and revelation cannot be escaped. This is why he warned against spiritual laziness, not dramatic sin alone, but gradual neglect, the habit of prayer postponed, the conscience silenced, just this once, the forgiveness delayed because pride felt justified. He said these choices seem small, but they train the soul in avoidance, and avoidance becomes instinct. At judgment, instinct matters more than intention. He also warned against despair, which he called the devil's favorite disguise. Despair convinces the soul that change is impossible, that the past is final, that prayer is useless. Padre Pio rejected this fiercely. He said that as long as a soul breathes, mercy remains accessible. Even at the final breath, humility can still open a door, but despair slams it shut from the inside. This is why intercession is an act of warfare. Padre Pio saw prayer as a direct challenge to despair. Every prayer declares that no soul is abandoned, no moment is wasted, no life is beyond reach. When the living pray for the dead, they refuse the lie that separation is total. They participate in the communion of saints, not as theory, but as action. If you are listening to this story and thinking of someone who has died, someone whose faith was uncertain, whose choices trouble you, whose ending feels unresolved, This message is for you. Padre Pio would say, pray now, not because you are late, but because love is never late. Time does not limit mercy. God applies prayer where it is most needed, not where it is most convenient. He once said that many souls in heaven arrived there because someone they barely knew prayed for them once, without understanding why. He called these prayers keys that unlock doors long after the hand that held them has forgotten. Nothing offered in love disappears. Nothing sincere is wasted. Padre Pio also taught that intercession transforms the one who prays. When you pray for the dead, you rehearse your own death. You learn detachment. You practice surrender. You remember that you too will stand exposed one day. This does not create fear, it creates clarity. It rearranges priorities. It makes forgiveness urgent and humility attractive. Toward the end of his life, Padre Pio spoke less of souls visiting him and more of souls ignoring themselves. He worried less about extraordinary sins and more about ordinary indifference. He said the greatest danger was not hatred of God, but forgetfulness of God. Forgetfulness dulls the soul until love feels unnecessary. That soul, he said, suffers most at judgment not because God is harsh, but because awakening is painful. And yet, his final message was never fear. It was urgency wrapped in hope. Pray now, love now, forgive now, intercede now. Do not wait for certainty, act from charity. Heaven responds to charity faster than understanding. If this reflection has stirred something in you, consider responding not with emotion alone, but with action. Pray for one soul today. Say their name aloud, even if you are unsure where they stand. If you feel moved, share this story or leave a comment. You may never know how far a single act of remembrance can reach. The night Padre Pio prayed for a king reminds us of something essential. Before God, there are no crowns, no titles, no historical roles. There are only souls. Souls shaped by what they loved, what they avoided, what they surrendered, and what they refused. And among those souls, the prayers of the living still matter. Padre Pio believed that when history is finally revealed in its fullness, we will be shocked not by wars or rulers, but by the hidden exchanges of mercy, by how often prayer changed outcomes unseen, softened judgments unknown, and lifted souls no one remembered. In the end, this story is not about a king of England or a friar in Italy. It is about you, about how you live now, about how you pray now, about whether you choose indifference or intercession, because one day someone will stand where that king stood, and one day someone may pray for you. That is the legacy Padre Pio wanted to leave behind, not fear of judgment, but trust in mercy, not fascination with death, but responsibility for love. Pray, hope, and do not worry.